Souls Unitarian Universalist Church, building community, inspiring growth, creating change. Here in the heart of Kansas City, we come together to create this hour of shared reflection so that we might be renewed in courage for these times and inspired to lives of greater dignity, higher purpose, deeper generosity, and more effective action. If you are new to Unitarian Universalism or to our congregation, we want to get to know you and share part of your journey. If this place is already your spiritual home, welcome once more. We need one another, and it is good to be together again. Because we care for one another's safety, our congregation is gathering online during this long season of coronavirus pandemic. Nevertheless, through the gifts of technology, we continue to celebrate community and connections as we lean into the values of justice, compassion, and reason. Together, we learn the love that has the power to overcome both loneliness in the heart and oppression in the world. Welcome to our service this morning. May the words and music and images that we offer today nourish our best selves, calling forth abundant wisdom and love.
Arise, O souls,
Good morning, and welcome to this gathering of the All Souls community. Whoever you are, wherever you are on your spiritual journey, we are glad that you have joined us for this hour. The day before yesterday, on Friday evening, the start of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. The world has lost a model of fierce integrity, a woman of vast intelligence and persistence. Our nation has lost a warrior for justice on behalf of all who are marginalized among us. Her Jewish background was part of her inspiration to fight for the disenfranchised, she once said. That tradition teaches that only a tzedek, the most righteous person, dies on Rosh Hashanah Eve, having been allotted the fullest extent of their final year. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a tzedek in the deepest way, an example and teacher, an inspiration, representing the best of what our legal system calls upon us to be: wise, impartial, compassionate, a pursuer of true justice within the practice of law. Her absence is felt already. As Adlai Stevenson wrote at the death of Eleanor Roosevelt, "We are lonelier now. Someone has gone from our lives who was like the promise of refuge, and someone has gone from the world who is like a certainty of honor." Zecher Tzedek Livracha. May the memory of this righteous one be a blessing. Still the earth tilts on its axis, and the hours of daylight shorten, balanced for a moment with darkness as the season turns. Shana Tova. May you be inscribed in the book of life for the coming year. Wake up, repent, cast away wrongdoing, make amends. You must choose. Will your life be a blessing or a curse upon others? We gather here in this covenant community of memory and promise to be reminded, to pay attention to the turning of the year and to the turning of the heart that longs for authentic connection, for right relationship. To remember that it is in our hands to restore what is broken, to practice tikkun olam, the healing of the world's fractured wholeness and our own. Today, on the pivot of summer to winter, we kindle once again the light of this flaming chalice. In its glow, may we be sustained and fortified for all that lies ahead, and may our gathered lights offer the radiance of hope to all who grieve, to all who repent, to all who seek recognition, to all who dream together of a better world. May the one who brings peace throughout the universe bring peace to us all. That's fine. Will you join me now in speaking once again the words of our covenant promise to one another here in this community of helpers and seekers? Together we affirm, goodwill is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Our opening song asks us to send our thoughts to all who are found in prison cells and dungeons vile, and urge them not to be ashamed, but to trust the bells of freedom that call for the end of all forms of tyranny. It offers a daring vision of the world that is possible, a new creation that we all long to see. So let us renew that hope in our hearts and discover that indeed we cannot keep from singing. These are difficult days for liberals. Watching the shameless hypocrisy and corruption of the current administration unfold in Washington and across the nation. The principles of democracy itself appear to be at risk, and divisive rhetoric and threats are loud in the land. At such a moment, our faith heritage demands that we not surrender to despair. Large and complex national systems may indeed be beyond our control. We must ride out the tides of history like everyone else. But remember, democracy did not begin in huge bureaucracy. At its core, government of the people, by the people, for the people, is a local, relational enterprise. Without the voluntary associations, person-to-person connections that organize our energy for mutual concern and the common good, all larger government degenerates into naked exercises in power. Now is the time to double down on neighborhoods, PTAs, local chapters, committees of concerned citizens, and yes, congregations. Now is the time to weave the fabric of community tighter, to hang on to the folks whose values we share. Now is the time to invest in the health and future of whatever brings us together, gives us courage, and reminds us that we are not alone. Now is the time to put our resources of creativity and energy and money where our hearts are, including here, so that this church continues to have a voice for reason, tolerance, diversity, and integrity in our public life. Now is the time to lay the almost unseen foundations for the world we want to build, by strengthening our connections, by creating the informal institutional web of which federal authority is no part. Now is the time to keep this church and others like it vibrant and thriving, staffed and energized and accessible to all who seek to live by values beyond narrow self-interest and self-serving. Now is the time to make a contribution to the work of this congregation as an act of freedom, of integrity, of love. This morning's offering will now be gratefully received.
Peace is flowing like a river, flowing out through you and me, flowing out into the desert, setting all the captives free. Love is flowing like a river, floating out through you and me, flowing out into the desert, setting all the captives free. Healing's flowing like a river, flowing out through you and me, flowing out into the desert, setting all the captives free. Hope is flowing like a river, flowing out through you and me, flowing out into the desert, setting all the captives free. Justice is flowing like a river, flowing out through you and me, flowing out into the desert, setting all the captives free. Setting all the captives free.
Let's say together the words of dedication for our offering. We dedicate our offerings and our actions to the mission at the heart of this congregation, to build a respectful, caring community, to inspire personal and spiritual growth, and to create change toward a just and compassionate society. Amid the protests and civil unrest this past summer, many questions have been raised about the role of the police and our national structures of law enforcement. As calls to defund and abolish both police departments and the prison industry have been put forth, my mind went back to a vague memory of a long ago initiative by our own Unitarian Universalist Service Committee that had to do with a moratorium on prisons. I'm here today with my friend and colleague, Dr. Lee Barker, President Emeritus of my alma mater seminary, Meadville Lombard Theological School. Several decades ago, when we were both in formation for ministry, Lee, I understand that you worked with the UUSC on that project. And so I wanted to speak with you now to ask what the thinking was about these issues at that time. Am I right in remembering that there was such an initiative? Remind me how it came about and what it was.
Well, the UUSC, Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, moratorium on prison construction project was actually a legislative advocacy project. And the idea was to advocate for the not yet abolition of prisons, but the taking a pause to reflect on the role of prisons in the criminal justice system and in society at large. The idea behind it was that prisons were not actually reforming people. The recidivism rate was great. It was unjust in the way that it meted out punishment. And I think it's also important to note, Kendyl, that this was not strictly a Unitarian Universalist program, that it was really in the water of the whole critique of the criminal justice system. And criminologists had really latched onto this idea as one that could be an effective way to create change. The UUSC in Washington, D.C., took up the legislative approach to that idea. And it was functioning from about 1969 to, I take that back. It was in the mid 70s to the early 80s for the Unitarian Universalists. I think that at the time there was a great recognition that that there was this huge business interest that had really been fueling the explosion of prison beds in the United States.
Well, what we would today call the prison industrial complex.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the thing about that prison industrial complex is what you knew is that if you build them, they will come. I mean, they immediately didn't just fill those beds. A room for 2 was immediately filled by 4 inmates. So, which told you something, which told you that the prison system was actually simply just filling beds when they didn't necessarily need to. And that who was being incarcerated? It was the poor. It was the disadvantaged. It was the minority. It was minority people. And so it was just, it was thought that this was a vulnerable point, that if we were going to really get our hands around the criminal justice system to make it truly just, not just in name, that this was a leverage point to begin to address the inequities in the system. So people understood that, but their alternatives, they couldn't see alternatives, which was also a part of the moratorium on prison construction, was to advance the possibility of alternatives to incarceration.
So if not prisons, then what?
Exactly.
Yeah. So do you have a sense of how successful or not successful that initiative was?
Well, I think it was, if you take a really long view, maybe it was sort of successful. If you take a really short view, it was not successful at all. And it was not successful, I think, for a number of reasons. And one of which I mentioned, which was it's such a high concept. People feel so vulnerable when they think about crime around them, and they want that feeling of vulnerability eradicated as quickly as possible. They see prisons and the criminal justice system as a way of protecting them from their fellow citizens who have transgressed the law.
Do you see parallels or significant differences between the situation then and the situation now? Are there things that we can bring forward?
Yeah, I see parallels, and I see some, but I also see some. That was a phrase that was intended to get people's intent. What? You're going to stop building prisons? What? You're going to stop defunding? You're going to stop funding the police? But they're both intended to kind of interrupt the system, an unjust system. One of the things that I've seen is that in the polls for the defund the police movement is that Americans seem to have a pretty sophisticated understanding about what that means. And if you go beyond the phrase, they understand that it doesn't mean having no police. They mean having a different approach to policing, a different systemic approach to policing than we have now. And I have to think that one of the reasons is another major difference in the between these two projects. One didn't have the empathy. It didn't have a way of arousing the empathy of people to see the injustice of the system. Defund the police has these incredible videos of people being literally killed, murdered by police, and it creates a huge fire of empathy in people that gives them a different understanding of defund the police than people had of, abolish the prisons. Well, it's interesting because one of the ways that I've thought about this was COVID and how COVID is found its way into the prisons.
Yes.
And people have, and government officials have found a way to release prisoners to protect, I'm not sure who they're trying to protect, but from the coronavirus. And if you can turn that switch on and say, oh, look, we have a pandemic. We should let a lot of people out of prison right now. Should those people have ever been there in the first place? I think is a really good question. And it highlights that both the ineffectiveness of prisons in general, and it highlights the fact that there are so many people there who, would do better in some other kind of setting, in some other kind of program, a less costly program as well.
This is from Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. Going into prison is deeply confusing if you know anything about the racial demographics of America. The extreme overrepresentation of people of color, the disproportionate sentencing of racial minorities, the targeted prosecution of drug crimes in poor communities, the criminalization of new immigrants and undocumented people, the collateral consequences of voter disenfranchisement, and the barriers of re-entry can only be fully understood through the lens of our racial history. When I first went to death row in December 1983, America was in the early stages of a radical transformation that would turn us into an unprecedentedly harsh and punitive nation and result in mass imprisonment that has no historical parallel. Today, we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. The prison population has increased from 300,000 people in the early 1970s to 2.3 million people today. There are nearly 6 million people on probation or on parole. 1 in every 15 people born in the United States in 2001 is expected to go to jail or prison. 1 in every 3 black male babies born in this century is expected to be incarcerated. For years, we have been the only country in the world that condemns children to life imprisonment without parole. Nearly 3,000 juveniles have been sentenced to die in prison.
We've created laws that make writing a bad check or committing a petty theft or minor property crime an offense that can result in life imprisonment. We have declared a costly war on people with substance abuse problems. There are more than 500,000 people in state or federal prisons for drug offenses today, up from just 41,000 in 1980. We've given up on rehabilitation, education, and services for the imprisoned because providing assistance for the incarcerated is apparently too kind and compassionate. We are all implicated when we allow other people to be mistreated. An absence of compassion can corrupt the decency of a community, a state, a nation. Fear and anger make us vindictive and abusive, unjust and unfair, until we all suffer from the absence of mercy, and we condemn ourselves as much as we victimize others. The closer we get to mass incarceration and extreme levels of punishment, the more I believe it's necessary to recognize that we all need mercy, we all need justice, and perhaps we all need some measure of unmerited grace.
Billy Rose was a low-rider, Billy Rose was a night fighter, Billy Rose knew trouble like the sound of his own name. Busted on a drunken charge, driving someone else's car, the local midnight sheriff's claim to fame. In an Arizona jail there are some who tell the tale how Billy fought the sergeant for some milk that he demanded, knowing they'd remain the boss, knowing he would pay the cost. They saw he was severely reprimanded. In the blackest cell on A block, he hanged himself at dawn, with a note stuck to the bunkhead. Don't mess with me, just take me home. Come and lay, help us lay young Billy down. Luna was a Mexican, the law calls him an alien for coming across the border with a baby and a wife. Though the clothes upon his back are wet, still he thought he could get some money and some things to start a life. It hadn't been too very long when it seemed like everything went wrong. They didn't even have the time to find themselves a home. This foreigner, a brown-skinned male, thrown inside a Texas jail, he left the wife and baby quite alone. He eased the pain inside him with a needle in his arm, but the dope just crucified him. He died to no one's great alarm. Come and lay, help us lay young Luna down. And we're gonna raise the prisons to the ground. Kilowatt was an agent con of 65 who stood a chance to stay alive and leave the joint and walk the streets again. As the time he was to leave drew near, he suffered all the joy and fear of leaving 35 years in the pen. And on the day of his release, he was approached by the police, who took him to the warden, walking slowly by his side. warden said, "You won't remain here," but it seems a state retainer claims another 10 years of your life. He stepped in the Texas sunlight. The cops stood all around. Old Kilowatt ran 50 yards, then threw himself down on the ground. They might have laid, just have laid that old man down. But we're gonna raise the prisons to the ground. Oh, help us raise the prisons. Help us raise the prisons to the ground.
Americans are fed up with our criminal justice system. Some of us are mad at the police, and others are mad at us for not supporting the police. There are those who say that there is too much crime because criminals get away with everything. Others think that crime is, in some part, a valid response to an unjust, dysfunctional society. It appears that if you are a relatively rich white lawyer working for the president, the legal system will treat you differently than if you are a poor black person reaching for your driver's license. We are not in agreement about what constitutes a crime or what ought to. Some of us are quite certain of the righteousness of our opinions. Many of us are confused, anxious, unsure of the problem, let alone the solution. I submit that this is not by accident. All other things being equal, societies carefully curate their members' anxieties in order to make sure that the public will assent to the measures that serve to maintain existing power structures. And whenever our collective fears are preyed upon like this, it seems to me there is a theological or spiritual issue to be dealt with, which is why I'm wading into the morass this morning. We are wrestling with both new information and new perspectives. A decade ago, Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, assembled a plethora of data showing the exponential growth of what has been called the carceral state and the for-profit prison industry. She illustrated how this institution has focused disproportionately on black men and how it represents the extension of America's enduring fear of and effort to regulate racial minorities. 4 years later, Brian Stevenson shared the stories of his work as a lawyer with those condemned to death or life in prison in his book, Just Mercy. Both of these volumes document the deeply systemic inequalities and vast human suffering that are built into the American system of incarceration. That system looms over the life of communities of color, impacting families and neighborhoods, creating fear, distrust, and contempt for law enforcement and all the apparatus of so-called justice. Our legal system is in no part, neither in practice nor intent, color neutral, as the dominant culture has invited us to believe. Rather, it perpetuates the concept that black lives are and ought to be controlled by white authority. And that is not an unfortunate misperception or a mistake that needs to be corrected. It is inherent in the history of both policing and imprisonment, beginning in colonial days and reasserted many times over the past 4 centuries and into our own era. The cultural history of imprisonment begins with one of its 8 purposes, and that is custody or restraint, preventing an accused person from departing before judgment can be rendered about them. Its initial purposes were to keep alleged criminals in hand while they awaited a structured trial and to hold on to enemy combatants in war until they could be ransomed by their leadership. In neither of these cases was the situation intended to be permanent, nor was its duration a function of what the imprisoned person might have done. Once tried by the authorities, if the accused criminal were condemned, they would be subjected to some form of punishment, of which continued imprisonment was not usually an option. If they had power and resources, the sentence was usually a fine, unless it was a capital crime, in which case they would be executed. People with less status and money were more likely to be whipped, permanently maimed, publicly shamed, exiled, sold into servitude, or executed. Their confinement before and during the trial was not necessarily intended to constitute suffering, although this depended a great deal on where the accused was held and by whom. We know, for instance, that when Michael Servetus was imprisoned in Geneva during his trial for heresy, he was kept in appalling conditions, which was quite intentional on John Calvin's part. The other conceptual forerunner of modern incarceration was the British workhouse, where people considered to be vagrants, what we might today call homeless, and those believed to be at risk of potentially committing crimes, were confined and forced to do various kinds of labor. Leading a roguish or vagabondish trade or life was a punishable offense in 16th century England, and the establishment of the workhouse was thought to be a reform over whipping and branding in dealing with such people. It served a threefold purpose in that it constrained them from committing petty crimes of theft and vandalism abroad in the community. It compelled them to participate in some sort of allegedly useful activity for the public benefit, and it was thought to teach the virtues of productive labor and a regulated life. While not yet delineated by color, the workhouse was certainly a mechanism for enforcement of the preferences of upper-class, rich, and powerful people upon those who resisted their control structures and potentially constituted a threat to their dominance. Prisons came to America with the European colonists. They were not a feature of indigenous culture. Spanish soldiers built the first substantial prison in North America in the 1560s in Florida. Historians have estimated that something between 50,000 and 120,000 convicts were transported from England to North America during the colonial period. Penal servitude was a legal punishment, but this meant living as an indentured servant to a private citizen, usually in their home, who often paid the state for the right to these years of a convict's service. In 1779, Parliament formally authorized the construction of 2 penitentiaries in London, modeled on workhouses, but intended to confine convicted criminals for periods of punishment. Although these particular facilities were never actually built, they represent the fusion of ideas about the removal of criminals from society and the imposition of labor and structure on the lives of those considered dissolute. A religious claim also began to be made around this time, particularly by pious evangelicals, that part of the issue with crime was insufficient moral instruction. and lack of opportunity for spiritual self-awareness. If a person's life was chaotic and frantic with want, they urged, that person could never calmly consider the right way to live or the long-term consequences of their actions. This is what gave rise to the term penitentiary, as an institution intended to facilitate reflection and repentance for sin, as well as removal from various temptations. Reform of the corrupt criminal justice system was a particular agenda for the Anabaptist advocates of nonviolence on both sides of the Atlantic, who saw harsh punishments as a form of state violence in which all citizens were implicated. In the late 1700s, right around the time of the American Revolution, these advocates achieved a shift in thinking about both the purpose and the nature of prisons, which newly independent Americans embraced in part as a differentiation from the abuses of the English monarchy. The new idea was that the point of sentencing criminals to spend time in prison was not to extract retributive labor from them, but to reform them so that they would become honest and productive members of society. In order for this to work, it was believed that inmates needed to be separated from their disruptive effect on one another. The idea of confining them to solitary individual cells arose. At the same time, utilitarian rationalists like Jeremy Bentham argued that criminals should be persuaded that committing crimes was logically inexpedient. They favored arrangements by which prisoners were isolated from each other and performed labor during their waking hours. It was not until the second decade of the 19th century, during an era of social reform that included calls for the abolition of slavery, that most American states discontinued all legal penalties except for fines, imprisonment, or execution. By that point, the vision of the penitentiary, with its separated cells, had been implemented in the nation's two state-of-the-art prison facilities, one in Auburn, New York, where inmates labored in a common workroom by day without being allowed to speak or communicate with each other, and were isolated for sleeping, and the other in Cherry Hill, Pennsylvania, where the workday was also spent in separated cells, which prisoners rarely ever left. Both arrangements made no provision for any relational contact, either with family or supposedly corrupting outsiders or with other inmates. While these regimes were advocated by humanitarian-minded reformers like Dorothea Dix, their mental health impacts were not surprisingly devastating. The greater expense of maintaining the fully isolated Pennsylvania model prevented its wide adoption, but the Auburn system became the archetype of the American concept of prison down to our own day. The ideal of insulating prisoners from the bad influences of other deviants by cutting them off from all social connections also served to remove the application of criminal justice from broader public awareness and made persistent abuses within the system largely invisible. Waves of immigration following the Civil War filled these so-called penitentiaries with foreigners deemed to be of the criminal classes, and much was written about inherited depravity and the phrenology of a typical felon. Leasing of prison labor was practiced both in the North and in the South, the difference being that businesses set up manufacturing facilities within northern prisons, while convicts were sent out for agricultural or construction labor in the South. By the end of Reconstruction era, criminal conviction and imprisonment for arbitrary offenses such as vagrancy returned many recently freed blacks to a condition of functional slavery as leased prisoners. At no point since then in the past 150 years has the ethnic identity of the prison population remotely reflected the demographics of the nation. At no point since then has the reality of imprisonment reflected the practice, proposed intentions of the penitentiary method either. In theory, this form of prison is supposed to be a place of safety and moral order, where it is possible for inmates to gain new trust in a basically benevolent social structure. Instead, such facilities have consistently been places of violence, corruption, and abusive authority. In 1971, psychology professor Philip Zimbardo's famous Stanford prison experiment demonstrated how quickly and easily randomly selected students role-playing inmates and guards were induced into genuine mutual hostility, violence, and cruel behavior which the students themselves found shocking and inexplicable upon reflection. This study, which happened around the same time that the Youth Service Committee was advocating a legislative agenda to put a moratorium on the construction of new prisons, cannot be said to demonstrate anything conclusively, but it is profoundly suggestive. To my mind, at least, it raises the question of whether any ordinary human being is capable of administering an institution where they have absolute power over others in such a way that they do not become arbitrary, tyrannical, and primarily concerned with compliance. In other words, is an uncorrupt, non-violent prison actually possible? If so, what is the work that needs to be done to bring it about? And if not, how do we begin to reconceive a more just response to crime? If prisons don't work and inherently can't work, why are we funding them? And what might we be doing instead? I do not have an answer to any of these questions, more's the pity. But I do think that it is time to reconsider a model that in a century and a half has never been successful in its purported purposes, and that appears at first glance to re-traumatize its victims and create moral injury among its operators. As Bryan Stevenson reminds us, we are all implicated when we allow other people to be mistreated. An absence of compassion can corrupt the decency of a community, a state, a nation. Fear and anger can make us vindictive and abusive, unjust and unfair, until we all suffer from the absence of mercy, and we condemn ourselves as much as we victimize others. Fear and anger can make us vindictive and abusive. The culture of empire cultivates that fear and anger, rarely more overtly than at this moment, but it can be done subtly too when that serves the powers that be. Almost 50 years ago, Joan Baez urged us to raise the prisons to the ground. But the notion is older than that, by far. As long ago as the 5th century before the Common Era, a Jewish prophet in the tradition of Isaiah announced his message from God in these words: "The Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings unto the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prisons to them that are in bondage." Jesus would later cite this passage from the Jewish scriptures to describe his own mission. The question of prison abolition has been before us for quite some time, it would seem, and for all our civilized progress, we have yet to arrive at a morally coherent answer. UU activists and hymnidists Carolyn McDade and Barbara Zanotti turned this same prophetic biblical announcement into an anti-war hymn in 1979, and its vision remains radical. In order to bind up the broken and restore the ruins of generations, we must let the captives go free. Let us ponder that together in song.
We'll build a land where we bind up the broken. We'll build a land where the captives go free, where the oil of gladness dissolves all mourning. Oh, we'll build a promised land that can be. Come to the land where people together, anointed by wisdom, made and create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream. We'll build a land where we bring the good tidings to all the afflicted and all those who mourn, and we'll give them garments instead of ashes. Oh, we'll build a land where peace is born. Come to the land where people together, anointed by wisdom, made and create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream. We'll be a land building up ancient cities, raising up devastations from old, restoring ruins of generations. Oh, we'll build a land of people so bold. Come to the land where people together, anointed by wisdom, made and create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fires of commitment. For all these we carry in our minds and hearts until we are together again. Brian Stevenson says, there is a strength, a power even, in understanding that each of us is broken, because embracing our brokenness creates a need and a desire for mercy, and perhaps even a corresponding need to show mercy. When you experience mercy, you learn things that are hard to learn otherwise. You see things you can't see otherwise. You hear things you can't otherwise hear. You begin to recognize the humanity that resides in all of us. In these days of awe, so may it be for us all.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.
Thank you for joining us this morning. We hope you'll be part of our virtual coffee hour and conversation by joining the Zoom link on our webpage. And we also hope that you will be with us next week when we look at UU the Vote, our denominational approach to the upcoming elections. Please, everyone, stay safe and be well this week.